Give your panel a quick wipe down with some soapy water. What I like to do is I like to wrap sandpaper around a card or something that's flat and sharp. This gives you control, and I guess it acts like a sanding block, and just get in there and try and remove as much rust as possible, as this will prevent the touch-up paint from sticking. So to try and get as much rust as you can out of that scratch. So once all of the rust has been removed, you want to get your isopropyl alcohol and give the surface a wipe down with a cloth or a paper towel. So with the same back and forth motion, you want to try and smoothen out the edges of the scratch, as this will help the touch-up paint blend a lot better. The last thing you want is sharp, jagged edges. So yeah, just try and smoothen out those edges as much as you can. As I was sanding, the scratch just became wider and wider as the paint kept flaking, and again wipe down with the isopropyl alcohol as the dust builds up. So after smoothing out the edges, the next step is to just refine the scratch and re-level it, just to make it less hilly, and the aim is to make it as smooth as possible, so you cannot pick the scratch with your finger. This is an important step as it allows the touch-up paint to adhere. So after the sanding step has been completed and you have smoothened out the scratch as much as possible, the next step is the taping part. So you want to just quickly give your scratch another wipe with some isopropyl alcohol. This is to remove as much of that grease and dust that has been left over. Before applying the paint, I'm going to mask off the surrounding area with tape. This helps to isolate the repair and to keep the paint exactly where it needs to be, so it doesn't overlap with the factory paint. As you can see, my scratch isn't in a straight line, so I have to use smaller pieces of tape just to really get into those little edges. Just try your best to adjust the tape to the shape of your scratch. Alright, so at this point I have sanded down the scratch and I have masked the scratch off, so it has been prepped and it is smooth and ready for painting. So the first step is to apply the primer. I try to avoid dragging the paint to avoid leaving streaks and blotches. I just tried using singular strokes, so the goal here was to use one smooth controlled stroke and then leave it and let it dry itself and level out. You want to avoid rushing and just take your time. After you have completed your first layer, leave it for the suggested time that's instructed on your bottle. For me, I left it for 15 minutes and then went ahead for the second layer. 2 thin layers are enough for primer. So I did make a slight error as I applied the base coat immediately after I applied the 2 layers of primer, and I didn't realize I was supposed to let it set for 24 hours that was suggested on the bottle until after. So that's why I went ahead and applied the base coat straight away after the 2 layers were completed. So yeah, of course I didn't wait the suggested 24 hours on this area, but the same technique really. Use singular strokes. Try to avoid going back over the same area and try to avoid dragging the paint. I went with a total of 7 coats, so I started out with thin layers, and then as I got to maybe the 3rd or 4th I went with a bit more paint, but not too much, of course. The goal here is, of course, to overlap the surrounding factory coat, so that way when sanding it will blend in nicely. Go ahead and grab some more paint, not too much. Don't want to have blobs. Nice thin layers. Try to cover the area to the best of your ability. And then, yep, after the first layer has been completed, you want to leave it for 15 minutes. That was what was suggested on my bottle, and go ahead with the second layer. So as you can see, I left the other areas untouched for the reason I previously mentioned. So I'm just going to go ahead and, with the same technique, apply the 2 thin layers of primer on the other areas. And then after letting the primer properly cure for 24 hours, I continued with the base coat. Same technique, 7 layers, starting out thin. So I have left the paint for a total of 24 hours, and now it's time to remove the masking tape. I tried to peel the tape at an angle away from the paint just to prevent peeling. If you pull the tape too quickly, it can damage the fresh paint, and the idea is just want to take your time and try to remove the tape as evenly and neatly as you can. So the next step is to wet sand and try and blend the paint with the surrounding factory paint. And with this, I'm going to be using 800 grit sandpaper. I used an old Nokia battery to act as a sanding block, just to get that even surface, just to avoid uneven sanding. And just with a back and forth motion, try to cover the whole area of the scratch and blend it in the best you can. The center defect was dented, and this did make it quite difficult for me to sand around those areas, but I tried the best I could, really. And again, give the panel a wipe down with some isopropyl alcohol. I applied the clear coat at night, and some of the sanding marks were more visible and noticeable, but with the same technique as you would use with the base coat and primer. I mean, you don't have to be as careful, as long as you cover as much of the scratch as you can. That's all that matters, really, as it's going to be sanded down eventually. So just try to get the best coverage. I applied light and thin coats, and I went with 3 or 4 layers. I think that's about enough. And then once one layer was completed, I will let it settle for maybe 10-15 minutes, and then move on to the second and third and fourth, and then eventually I left it to cure overnight. And then after letting it cure overnight, it's time to sand down the clear coat with the surrounding factory paint. So with 800 grit sandpaper and with a back and forth motion, I'm going to sand down the clear coat. So once you have sanded down the clear coat to the point where you are able to run your fingers smoothly over the factory paint, it is time to finish off with 3000 grit sandpaper and 5000 grit, and then polishing. As you can see, I'm not using my hands to sand, I'm using a sponge. This is to avoid the pressure points of your fingers, as that would cause uneven sanding. So just grab a sponge, wrap it around, wrap the sandpaper around the sponge, and just gently in a back and forth motion sand over the paint, and then switch over to the 5000 grit with the same technique. Use the sponge and in a back and forth motion. Try to avoid circular motions, as that can cause circular scratches. So with the touch-up paint kit that I bought, I was given this scratch and scruff remover. So what I did was I applied the scratch and scruff remover first, and then I applied the polish. And as the final step, get some polish on a buff, and with heavy pressure buff out the paint and the scratch.